Something strange is happening in this small town. A girl, gone without a trace for 3 years, is suddenly back, but she doesn't remember where she's been. A desperate mother clings to a truth she refuses to share. A father knows more than he lets on, and a detective stumbles upon a case that was never meant to be reopened. But the deeper they dig, the more they realize nothing is as it seems. Secrets buried for years will come to light, but the truth may be more heartbreaking than anyone ever imagined. Stay until the end, because the final revelation will change everything. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. Now let's begin. The day had started like any other in the quiet town of Willow Creek. The early autumn breeze carried the scent of dried leaves through the streets, swirling them around the feet of pedestrians who hurried about their lives, unaware that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Emily Thompson sat at the small round table of her favorite cafe, stirring a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Her fingers trembled as she reread the letter she had received that morning, the words blurring together from the weight of their meaning. She's still alive. I saw her. A single sentence. No name, no return address, no further explanation. But Emily knew exactly who she was. Lillian, the sister she had lost 3 years ago. The sister everyone had given up on. The sister Emily had been forced to forget. Her mother had insisted there was nothing left to search for. Her father had refused to even speak about it. The town had moved on, as though Lillian had never existed. But now someone was telling her otherwise. Emily folded the letter with shaking hands and stuffed it into her coat pocket, her heart hammering. Who had sent this? And why now? She barely noticed when her phone vibrated on the table. It was a name she hadn't seen in years. Detective Daniel Carter. Her throat tightened. She hadn't spoken to him since the investigation was officially closed. Since the police had filed Lillian's disappearance under unresolved and let the case fade into a distant memory. She hesitated before answering. Detective Carter? Her voice was barely a whisper. Emily, I need to see you. It's about Lillian. The breath left her lungs. The entire world seemed to shift beneath her feet. You found something? A pause. Then, in a voice low and unreadable, he said, Meet me at the old train station. 20 minutes. Emily grabbed her coat, her tea forgotten, and rushed out into the chilly afternoon, her mind racing. She had spent 3 years forcing herself to move forward, convincing herself that Lillian was gone, that there was no hope left. But now everything was unraveling. She arrived at the abandoned train station, the old iron tracks covered in rust, the wooden platform worn and cracking with age. The place had been closed for over a decade, yet it still carried a strange, haunted energy. She spotted Detective Carter leaning against a pillar, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. You said this was about Lillian, she said, breathless. Tell me what you found. Carter exhaled and handed her a photograph. Emily's fingers clenched around the edges as she lifted it to the dimming sunlight. The image was grainy, taken from an old security camera. A young girl, no older than 10, standing near a storm drain on the edge of town. A girl who looked exactly like Lillian. Emily's stomach twisted. Where did you get this? It was left on my doorstep this morning. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. This couldn't be real. It had to be a mistake. This was taken recently? She asked, her voice shaking. Carter nodded. Less than 2 weeks ago. Emily's knees nearly buckled. If this was real, if Lillian was truly out there, then where had she been all this time? And why hadn't she come home? Carter ran a hand through his graying hair. Emily, listen to me. Someone wanted us to find this. But whoever they are, they don't want to be found. Emily looked back at the picture, her throat tightening. What if Lillian needs help? Carter's jaw tightened. Then we have to find her before it's too late. A sudden gust of wind sent a chill through Emily's spine, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt something stir deep inside her. Hope. But then, just as quickly, came the fear. Because if Lillian was still alive, it meant someone had been hiding her. And whoever they were, they had kept her secret for a reason. Emily had no idea what she was about to uncover, but she knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. Emily stood frozen, the photograph still clenched in her trembling hands. The girl in the image looked exactly like Lillian. The same wavy chestnut hair, the same round, wide eyes that always held a spark of mischief. It was her. It had to be. But how? For 3 years, Emily had mourned, grieved, and tried to move on, even though something inside her had always whispered that there was more to the story, that something wasn't right, that her sister hadn't just vanished into thin air. And now, standing here, staring at this impossible image, that whisper turned into a deafening scream. Where was this taken? Her voice was unsteady, but she forced herself to meet Detective Carter's gaze. He exhaled, crossing his arms as he glanced around the abandoned train station, as if making sure they weren't being watched. Outside of town, near Ridgewood Creek, Emily's breath hitched. Ridgewood Creek, a place she hadn't dared to think about in years. It was where they used to play as kids, climbing rocks, chasing each other through the tall grass, pretending they were explorers uncovering ancient secrets. But more than that, it was the last place she had seen Lillian. "I need to go there," she said, her hands gripping the photograph so tightly the edges bent. "Emily," Carter's voice was laced with hesitation. "I have to see it for myself." She cut him off. "I have to know if she was really there." Carter studied her for a moment before nodding. "I'll take you, but we need to be careful. Someone doesn't want this truth to come out." The drive to Ridgewood Creek was eerily silent, the weight of the photograph pressing against Emily's palm like an anchor. The further they drove, the more familiar the landscape became. The winding dirt road, the towering oak trees swaying in the wind, the faint scent of damp earth filling the air. It was like stepping back into a memory she had tried to bury. When Carter finally pulled to a stop near the clearing, Emily felt her stomach twist with unease. Everything was just as she remembered. The grass, slightly overgrown, the small wooden footbridge arching over the creek, the massive boulder where she and Lillian used to carve their initials into the stone. But there was something else, something new. A chill ran down her spine as she spotted it. A small pink ribbon tied to a branch, fluttering in the wind. Emily's chest tightened. Lillian had always worn a pink ribbon in her hair. Always. She felt her feet move before her brain registered what she was doing, pushing through the tall grass, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would shatter her ribs. "Emily, wait," Carter called, but she didn't stop. She reached the ribbon, her fingers shaking as she untied it from the branch. It was old, slightly faded, but unmistakable. Lillian's. A lump formed in her throat. She swallowed hard, willing herself to stay composed, to think rationally. But then she saw it, just a few feet away, partially buried beneath leaves and dirt. "Tiny shoe," Emily gasped, falling to her knees as she picked it up. It was covered in dust, the once bright white fabric now dull and stained. But she knew it. She remembered it. Lillian had been wearing these the day she disappeared. "Carter." Her voice broke as she turned, showing him what she had found. His expression darkened as he crouched beside her. "Someone left this here recently. It's not just some forgotten piece of the past." Emily's mind was spinning. If this had been here for years, it would have been covered, destroyed by the elements. But it wasn't. Someone had left it. For them. "It's a message," she whispered. Carter exhaled, scanning the area. "Or a warning." A rustling sound made them both freeze. Emily's pulse skyrocketed as she turned toward the trees, her breath caught in her throat. For a split second, she swore she saw someone, standing between the branches, the figure small, unmoving. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Carter was already reaching for his flashlight. He swept the beam through the trees, but there was nothing, only shadows. "There's someone here," Emily insisted. "Or someone was," Carter murmured. Emily's hands clenched into fists. Whoever it was, they weren't alone in this. Someone had been watching them. Someone had been waiting. "We need to go," Carter said firmly. We don't know who we're dealing with yet. Emily hesitated. Every part of her wanted to chase after whatever or whoever she had seen. But she knew he was right. They had to be smart about this. As they turned back toward the car, Emily stole one last glance at the trees. The shadows seemed to shift, swallowing whatever had been there. She didn't know what she had seen, but she knew one thing for sure. Someone didn't want her finding out the truth. And she was only just beginning to uncover how deep the secrets really went. Emily sat in the passenger seat of Carter's car, staring out the window as the town blurred past her. Her hands were still clutching the faded pink ribbon and the tiny, dust-covered shoe she had found at Ridgewood Creek. It didn't make sense. If Lillian had been gone for 3 years, why did it feel like she had never left? The ribbon, the shoe, they weren't remnants of the past. They were placed there, recently, deliberately, but by who and why? Carter's grip tightened around the steering wheel. He hadn't said much since they left the creek, but Emily could feel the tension radiating from him. He was thinking the same thing she was. Someone was playing a game with them, leaving breadcrumbs, leading them somewhere. "This changes everything," Carter finally said, breaking the silence. "We need to go back through the old case files, check for anything we might have missed. Someone was involved in Lillian's disappearance, and they're still here." Emily's stomach churned. "You think she was taken?" Carter's jaw clenched. "I don't know, but I do know that someone went through a lot of trouble to make sure we never found out what really happened." Emily looked down at the shoe in her lap, tracing her fingers over the dirt-stained fabric. "And now they want us to find her." Carter didn't respond, but his silence spoke louder than words. They drove straight to his office, a small, dimly lit room buried under stacks of unsolved case files and scattered notes. Emily had been here once before, the night Carter had told her there was nothing more he could do, that Lillian's case had gone cold, that they had exhausted every lead. But now, 3 years later, they were back where they started. And this time, they weren't giving up. Carter dug through an old filing cabinet, pulling out a thick, worn-out folder labeled Thompson, Lillian Missing Persons Case. Emily swallowed hard as he laid it on the desk, the weight of 3 years of unanswered questions pressing down on them. He flipped through the pages, scanning over the original witness statements, the police reports, the search grids, everything they had pieced together back then. Emily leaned over, her eyes darting across the reports, looking for something, anything, they had missed. Then she saw it. A name, one she had forgotten. "Wait," she said, pointing at a section of the report. "This man, this witness, he saw Lillian that night." Carter followed her finger and nodded. "John Whitmore. He was the last person to report seeing her. Said he saw her near the creek. But when we questioned him, he claimed he couldn't remember much else." Emily's heart pounded. "Did you ever follow up?" Carter exhaled. "I tried, but a few months later he packed up and left town. No forwarding address, no contact information. It was like he vanished too." Emily's fingers curled into fists. "Then we find him." Carter nodded. "I'll see if I can track him down." Emily leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Someone had erased Lillian, wiped her from existence. But now that someone was slipping up, leaving traces. And if they were leaving clues, it meant Lillian was still out there, somewhere. The next morning, Carter called with an address. "I found him." Emily barely gave herself time to breathe before she was in her car, driving toward the outskirts of town. The address led to a rundown trailer park, where the air was thick with the smell of rain-soaked earth. The trailer they were looking for sat at the very end of the row, its paint peeling, the windows covered with old newspapers. Emily knocked on the door. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. "Whitmore," Carter called. "We just want to talk." Silence. Emily exchanged a glance with Carter before reaching for the doorknob. It was unlocked. "This is a bad idea," Carter muttered. But Emily pushed the door open anyway. The inside was dark, cluttered with stacks of newspapers and unopened mail. A single flickering light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the room. Then they saw him. John Whitmore sat slumped in an old armchair, his face pale, his eyes staring blankly at the wall. Emily's breath caught. "Sir." Carter stepped forward. "Are you okay?" Whitmore blinked, his expression vacant, like he had been trapped in his own mind for years. "They told me to forget," he murmured. Emily froze. "What?" Whitmore's eyes darted to her, suddenly aware of her presence. He looked her over, his gaze lingering on her face as if searching for something. Then, in a whisper so low she almost didn't hear it, he said, "You look just like her." Emily's stomach dropped. Whitmore swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he gripped the arms of his chair. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "You weren't supposed to remember." Carter crouched beside him. "Who told you to forget?" Whitmore's breathing became shallow. His eyes darted to the window, his entire body stiff with fear. "They watch everything," he murmured. "They know you're here." Emily's heart pounded. "Who, John?" His lips trembled. "The ones who took her." The air in the room felt suddenly suffocating. Emily's mind raced. "Where is she?" she demanded. "Where's Lillian?" Whitmore's fingers dug into his knees. "Gone," he whispered, "just like she was supposed to be." Emily's vision blurred with frustration. "She's alive, isn't she?" Whitmore flinched at the words, his eyes darting toward the door. "I can't help you. Please." Emily's voice broke. "I just need to know where she is." Whitmore looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he exhaled shakily and muttered, "The storm drain." Emily's blood ran cold. Carter's face darkened. "What about it?" Whitmore squeezed his eyes shut, as if trying to block out whatever memory was resurfacing. "That's where they found her. That's where they took her back." Emily's breath caught. "Who?" But before he could answer, something outside made Whitmore's face twist in panic. He jumped from his chair and grabbed Carter's arm. "You need to leave. Now." Emily turned toward the window, her heart hammering. There was no one there. Nothing but the empty dirt road leading back into town. "John, listen to me." "No." His voice cracked. "They never wanted you to find her. If you keep looking, they'll make you forget too." Carter's hand was already on Emily's arm, pulling her toward the door. "We need to go." Emily resisted. "But now." Emily barely had time to process what had happened before she was outside, the cool air hitting her like a slap. Carter ushered her toward the car, his face set with determination. "We go to the storm drain," Emily whispered, still gripping the pink ribbon in her fist. Carter exhaled. "We go to the storm drain." As the car sped away from the trailer park, Emily cast one last glance in the rearview mirror. John Whitmore stood in the doorway watching them go, and just before they turned the corner, she swore she saw his lips move. "I'm sorry." The drive to the storm drain was suffocatingly silent. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the road, and the further they drove, the heavier the air became. Emily clutched the pink ribbon in her lap, her fingers gripping it so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her mind was racing, replaying Whitmore's words over and over again. That's where they found her. That's where they took her back. What did that mean? Who were they? And why had Whitmore looked so terrified? Beside her, Carter kept his eyes on the road, his jaw set in a hard line. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know when a witness was telling the truth. And Whitmore hadn't just been telling the truth. He had been desperate. That alone was enough to send a chill down Carter's spine. The storm drain was on the outskirts of town, a place that had been largely forgotten over the years. It was part of an old drainage system that had once been used to prevent flooding, but over time, it had been abandoned, left to decay. Emily remembered playing near it as a child, balancing on the concrete edge, tossing pebbles into the dark, gaping hole below. But now, as they approached, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle in her chest. Carter parked a few feet away, his hand lingering on the keys before pulling them out of the ignition. He turned to Emily. "You don't have to do this." Emily swallowed hard. "Yes, I do." She pushed the car door open and stepped out. The air smelled of damp earth and rust. The entrance to the storm drain loomed ahead, a massive tunnel of cracked concrete, its edges lined with moss and tangled weeds. The metal grate that once covered it was missing, leaving a dark void that stretched endlessly into the ground. Emily took a shaky breath and stepped closer. "Do you see anything?" Carter asked, his voice low. Emily shook her head. "Not yet." She crouched down, running her fingers along the dirt near the entrance. It was undisturbed, save for the scattered leaves and twigs. But then, just as she was about to stand, she saw it. Faint, but unmistakable. The footprint. Emily's stomach clenched. "Someone was here," she whispered. Carter knelt beside her, his fingers tracing the indentation in the dirt. It was small, a child's footprint. Emily felt her throat tighten. "Lillian," Carter exhaled sharply. "Or someone who wants us to think it's her." Emily's breath hitched. Why would someone do that? Carter didn't answer. Instead, he stood and pulled a flashlight from his coat, shining it into the tunnel. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing damp concrete walls covered in graffiti. The floor littered with fallen leaves and debris. It stretched far into the distance, disappearing into blackness. "I'm going in," Emily said, her voice steady, though her hands were shaking. Carter hesitated. "Emily, I have to." She cut him off. "If there's even the slightest chance she's down there, I can't walk away." Carter exhaled and nodded. "Then I'm going with you." They stepped inside, their footsteps echoing against the walls. The air was thick, heavy with moisture, and each step sent small splashes of water up their legs. Emily's heart pounded as she swept her flashlight over the walls, looking for anything that might tell her where Lillian had been. Then she saw it, carved into the concrete just a few feet inside the tunnel. Lillian. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Oh my God," she whispered, running her fingers over the name. The letters were uneven, scratched into the stone as if by a small, desperate hand. "She was here," Carter murmured, his voice barely audible. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. "Not just her." Carter turned to her, confusion flickering in his eyes. Emily pointed. Beneath Lillian's name, scratched just as deeply into the wall, was another word. "Help." Carter stiffened. Emily's vision blurred. "She was trying to tell us." Carter turned sharply, scanning the tunnel. If she was trapped here, she had to have gotten out somehow. Emily's mind was spinning. Lillian had been here, alive, but for how long? And if she had gotten out, where was she now? A sound echoed through the tunnel, making them both freeze. Faint rustling. Emily turned sharply, her flashlight flickering as she swept it over the darkness. What was that? Carter stepped forward cautiously. "I don't know." Then, another sound. A whisper. So soft, so distant, but unmistakable. "Emily." Emily's blood ran cold. Her name. Someone had whispered her name. She spun toward Carter, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "Did you hear that?" Carter's face was pale. "We're not alone." Emily's hands trembled as she turned back toward the tunnel, her flashlight beam shaking against the walls. "Who's there?" she called, her voice barely steady. Silence. Then suddenly something moved. A shadow, flickering at the edge of the tunnel's darkness. Emily's heart stopped. "Lillian." No answer. Carter grabbed her wrist. "We need to get out of here. Now." But Emily couldn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the damp ground. Because just beyond the beam of her flashlight, deep in the shadows, she saw it. The figure. Small. Still. Watching. Emily felt her breath catch, her chest tightening with something she couldn't explain. Hope. Terror. And then, the figure was gone. A rush of cold air swept through the tunnel, as if something had passed by them, something unseen. Emily gasped, stumbling backward. Carter grabbed her arm. "Come on." She barely registered what was happening as he pulled her toward the exit, her mind spinning. What had she just seen? Who had she just seen? They emerged from the tunnel, gasping for breath. The sky had darkened, the sun dipping below the horizon. The world felt different. Carter turned to Emily, his expression unreadable. "We're in over our heads." Emily's hands clenched into fists. "I don't care." Carter exhaled sharply. "Emily, listen to me. Whoever is behind this has spent 3 years making sure no one finds Lillian. And now, for some reason, they're leading us straight to her. We have to be careful." Emily's heart pounded. "She's alive, Carter. I can feel it." He didn't argue. He knew she was right, and that terrified him. As they stood in the fading light, the wind rustling through the trees, Emily made a silent promise to herself. She wasn't stopping. Not until she found her sister. Not until she uncovered the truth. Even if it destroyed everything she thought she knew. The night felt heavier than usual. The weight of what they had just experienced inside the storm drain pressed against Emily's chest, making it hard to breathe. She sat in Carter's car, staring at the tunnel entrance, her hands still trembling. The name scratched into the wall, the whispered voice calling her name, the shadow flickering just outside her reach. It was all too much, too real. Carter sat beside her, gripping the steering wheel but making no move to start the engine. His mind was racing, processing every clue, every unsettling detail. "We need to be smart about this," he finally said, his voice low. Emily turned to him, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "Smart? Carter, my sister is alive. She was there. She called my name." Carter exhaled sharply. "I know what we saw. I know what we heard. But we don't know what it means yet." Emily clenched her fists. "I can't just sit around waiting for answers. Someone is leaving clues for us. Someone wants us to find her." Carter hesitated before nodding. "And that's exactly why we need to be careful. Whoever took Lillian didn't want her to be found for 3 years. Why would they start now?" Emily opened her mouth to argue but stopped. He was right. Someone had gone through a lot of trouble to erase Lillian from existence. And now, suddenly, they were leading them toward her? Why? Carter finally started the car, driving them back toward town in silence. The road was dark, the trees lining it casting long, ghostly shadows in the headlights. Emily felt a growing sense of unease, as if they were being watched, as if whatever force had been lurking in the storm drain had followed them. They pulled up in front of Emily's house, but she made no move to get out. She wasn't sure she could handle stepping into the silence of her home, knowing she was still surrounded by unanswered questions. "Get some rest," Carter said softly. "I'll dig into some records, see if anything about that storm drain was ever documented. Maybe there's more to it than we realize." Emily swallowed hard and nodded, stepping out of the car. The house was dark when she entered, the familiar scent of home doing little to comfort her. She climbed the stairs slowly, her body heavy with exhaustion, but the moment she reached her bedroom, she froze. Something was different. Her desk drawer was slightly open. Her breath hitched as she stepped closer, slowly pulling it open. Inside, her belongings had been shifted, papers shuffled, pens displaced. And then she saw it. A photograph. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. It was an old picture taken when she was younger. She and Lillian, sitting on the front porch, their arms wrapped around each other. But something was wrong. Lillian's face was scratched out. Emily's blood ran cold. She stumbled back, her heart hammering. Someone had been in her house. Someone had been in her room. Her phone vibrated, making her jump. She fumbled to grab it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. A text message flashed on the screen. "Stop looking." Emily's fingers tightened around the phone. The fear that had been clawing at her chest transformed into something else. Anger. She wasn't stopping. Not now. Not ever. The next morning, she was at Carter's office before he had even finished his first cup of coffee. He took one look at her face and sighed. What happened? Emily tossed the photograph onto his desk. "Someone was in my house last night." Carter stiffened, picking up the picture. His expression darkened. "They're watching me," Emily whispered. "They don't want me to find her." Carter let out a slow breath, his jaw tight. "That just means we're getting closer." Emily swallowed hard. So what's next? Carter opened a folder on his desk. I looked into old records about the storm drain. Turns out it was originally connected to an underground maintenance tunnel. And guess what? That tunnel leads to an abandoned property on the outskirts of town. Emily's pulse quickened. What property? Carter slid another document toward her. It used to be a private medical facility, shut down years ago, but the building is still standing. Emily's fingers clenched around the paper. Then that's where we go next. Carter hesitated. We don't know what we're walking into. Emily met his gaze, determination burning in her eyes. I don't care. An hour later, they pulled up in front of the abandoned building. It was a looming structure, its windows shattered, ivy creeping up the walls. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and an eerie silence surrounded the place. I don't like this, Carter muttered, hand hovering near his pocket where he usually kept his gun. Except this time, he had left it behind. They weren't here for a confrontation. They were here for answers. They pushed open the rusted front door, stepping into the darkened hallway. Dust floated in the air, the remnants of a forgotten past. The floor creaked beneath their feet as they moved cautiously, scanning the walls for anything that might tell them what had happened here. Then Emily saw it. Another word scratched into the peeling paint of the wall. Lillian. Her breath caught. She was here, she whispered. Carter scanned the room. We need to check the records. If this was a medical facility, there had to have been patients. They made their way deeper into the building, searching room after room, until they found what they were looking for. An old filing cabinet, rusted and forgotten. Carter pulled it open, flipping through the brittle pages. Then he stopped. Emily, he said, his voice tight. She moved beside him, her heart pounding as he handed her a file. The name on it made her blood turn to ice. Lillian Thompson. Emily's vision blurred as she opened the file, scanning the words. Patient admitted for evaluation. Memory reconstruction therapy recommended. Memory reconstruction? She whispered. Carter's face was grim. They were erasing something. Emily flipped through the pages, her hands shaking. Then she found it, the last entry in the file. Patient transferred. Location unknown. Emily felt her knees go weak. She was taken, she murmured. They moved her before anyone could find out. Carter exhaled sharply. Then we find out where they took her. Emily turned to him, determination burning in her chest. And we bring her home. But just as the words left her lips, a noise echoed through the hallway. A soft, distant shuffle. Emily turned sharply, her breath catching. Footsteps. Someone else was here. Carter grabbed her arm. We need to go. Now. But Emily's eyes were locked on the darkness beyond the doorway, her pulse pounding in her ears. Because in that moment, she knew. Lillian was closer than they had ever imagined. And they weren't the only ones looking for her. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears as she stared into the darkened hallway, her breath caught in her throat. The sound of footsteps echoed softly through the abandoned building, distant but deliberate. Someone was here, watching, listening. She turned to Carter, who had already reached for her arm, his grip firm as he whispered, "We need to move." Emily's fingers tightened around the file she had found, the file that confirmed what she had feared all along. Lillian had been taken. But taken where? And by who? Carter scanned the shadows, his jaw clenched. We're not alone. We have to get out before. A noise. Closer this time. A door creaked open somewhere in the distance. Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe. They had come here for answers, but now they were in danger of finding something else entirely. Carter nudged her toward the back of the room, where an old maintenance door stood slightly ajar. We go through there, he whispered. Emily nodded, gripping the file to her chest as they slipped through the doorway. The air inside was thick with dust, the scent of mold pressing against her lungs. They moved carefully, Carter leading the way with his flashlight, their footsteps barely making a sound against the concrete floor. The hallway was long, lined with rusted metal cabinets and shattered glass. faded patient charts were scattered across the floor, the ink smudged with age. Emily's eyes darted over them, searching for any more traces of Lillian's name. Then she saw it. A photograph. She reached down, her fingers brushing against the curled edges as she picked it up. Her heart nearly stopped. It was a picture of two little girls, identical, holding hands. Their faces were blurred from time, but she knew. It was her and Lillian. A wave of emotion surged through her chest. "Emily," Carter urged. "Come on." But Emily couldn't move. She traced the edges of the photo, her mind racing. "They were watching us," she whispered. Even before she disappeared, Carter's expression darkened. "We have to keep going." Emily forced herself to nod, shoving the photo into her pocket as they pressed forward. The hallway twisted into another corridor, this one narrower, more claustrophobic. The walls were lined with faded medical posters, diagrams of the human brain, faded notes scribbled in the margins. Emily's stomach twisted as she read the words scrawled on the peeling wallpaper. "Erasure is the key. Memory can be rewritten." Carter followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. "They weren't just treating patients here," he murmured. "They were experimenting on them." Emily's blood ran cold. Then suddenly, a noise, louder this time, coming from ahead. Carter reached for her arm again, pulling her into the shadows of a doorway just as a figure stepped into view at the end of the hall. Emily's breath hitched. It was a man, dressed in dark clothing, moving slowly, his head tilting as if he were listening for something. Carter tensed beside her. "We wait," he mouthed. Emily nodded, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. The man took another step, then another. Then he stopped, right outside the room they were hiding in. Emily's fingers dug into the sleeve of Carter's jacket. A long pause. Then the man turned, walking away, disappearing down another corridor. Emily let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Carter didn't waste time. He grabbed her wrist and pulled her forward, leading her in the opposite direction. "We're leaving. Now." They moved quickly, weaving through the maze of decayed hallways, past the remnants of something they barely understood. Then they reached a door. A single word was painted on it in bold, red letters. "Records." Carter hesitated. This could be it. Emily's pulse quickened. "We have to look." Carter exhaled, glancing over his shoulder before pushing the door open. Inside, the room was dark, the air stale. Filing cabinets lined the walls, papers stacked haphazardly on the floor. Emily's eyes darted around, searching. Then, she saw it. A single drawer, slightly open. She rushed to it, her hands shaking as she pulled it open further. More files, more names. Then, Lillian Thompson. Her breath caught. "Oh my God," she whispered. She pulled the file out, her hands trembling as she flipped it open. Carter leaned over her shoulder, scanning the document. "Transferred to a secondary facility," he read aloud. "No address given." Emily's throat tightened. They moved her again. Then, at the very bottom of the page, a name. "Dr. Harrison Clark," Emily murmured. Carter's eyes narrowed. "Who the hell is that?" Emily's fingers tightened around the paper. "The man who took my sister." They had their lead. They had a name. And now, nothing was going to stop them from finding the truth. A sudden sound, louder this time. Footsteps. Closer. Carter's hand was already on her arm, pulling her toward the exit. "Run." They burst through the door, sprinting down the hallway. Emily's lungs burned, her heart racing as they navigated through the crumbling building, the sound of their pursuer growing closer behind them. Carter shoved open the back door, pulling Emily through just as something crashed behind them. They ran into the night, the cold air biting at their skin. Carter didn't stop until they reached the car, shoving the keys into the ignition and peeling away from the property. Only when they were miles away did he finally slow down, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Emily sat beside him, gasping for breath, the file clutched in her hands. "We found him," she whispered. Carter exhaled sharply. "Now we make him talk." Emily's hands shook as she looked down at the name written on the paper. Dr. Harrison Clark. Whoever he was, he had the answers they had been searching for. And Emily wasn't stopping until she got them. The name Dr. Harrison Clark was burned into Emily's mind. Every breath she took, every thought she had, circled back to that single name written at the bottom of Lillian's file. He was the key to everything. The one who had taken her, the one who had hidden her away, the one who had erased her existence from the world. And now, for the first time in 3 years, they had a lead. A real, tangible lead. Carter drove in silence, his grip on the steering wheel tight, his jaw clenched as they sped down the empty highway. Emily sat beside him, staring at the file in her lap, her hands gripping it like a lifeline. The air in the car was thick with unspoken words, but neither of them dared to break the silence. They both knew what was coming. "Where do we find him?" Emily finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carter exhaled sharply, adjusting his grip. "I ran his name through the system before we left the station. There's almost nothing on him. No medical license, no hospital records, just a few old addresses that lead to nowhere. Whoever he is, he's not just a doctor." Emily's stomach twisted. "Then how did he get access to Lillian?" Carter shook his head. "That's what we need to find out." Emily flipped through the file again, scanning every word, every line, desperate for something, anything, that would tell her where to go next. Then, at the very bottom of the last page, she found it. A phone number. Her pulse spiked. He left a number. Carter's eyes flicked to her, his expression dark. It could be a dead end. Emily didn't hesitate. She pulled out her phone and dialed before Carter could stop her. The line rang. Once, twice, then a click. Silence. Emily's breath caught. Then, "Who is this?" The voice on the other end was deep. Calm. Too calm. Emily's grip on the phone tightened. "Where is my sister?" A long pause. Then, a slow, measured response. "Emily Thompson." Her blood ran cold. He knew her name. "You've been looking for answers," he continued, his voice smooth, detached. "But you won't find them where you're searching." Emily's heart pounded. "Where is she?" Another pause. "Come see for yourself." The call ended. Emily pulled the phone away from her ear, her hands shaking. Carter's eyes were locked on her. "What did he say?" Emily swallowed hard. "He wants us to find him." Carter exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "That's a trap." Emily didn't care. "I don't care." Carter sighed, running a hand over his face. He knew there was no stopping her. "Where are we going?" Emily looked down at the file again, scanning the barely legible notes scribbled in the margins. Then she found it. A location. "The old Blackridge facility," she murmured. Carter tensed. "You've got to be kidding me." Emily's brows furrowed. "What?" Carter let out a slow breath. Blackridge was shut down over 15 years ago. It was a psychiatric research facility before it was condemned. There were rumors about what they did there, but nothing was ever proven. No one goes near it now. Emily's pulse raced. "Then that's exactly where we need to go." Carter hesitated. "Emily, listen to me. If we go there, we're walking into something we might not be able to get out of." Emily met his gaze, fire burning behind her eyes. "My sister is alive, and I'm not stopping until I bring her home." Carter exhaled heavily. "Then let's go." The drive to Blackridge felt like stepping into a nightmare. The facility was located on the outskirts of town, hidden deep within the woods, the road leading to it barely visible beneath overgrown branches and fallen leaves. The further they drove, the more isolated it felt, the world around them growing quieter, darker. When the building finally came into view, Emily felt her stomach twist. It was massive, a looming, crumbling structure, its windows shattered, the walls covered in vines. The air around it was eerily still, as if even nature had abandoned this place. Carter parked the car a few feet away, killing the engine. "Last chance to turn around," he muttered. Emily unbuckled her seatbelt. "I'm not leaving without her." They stepped out of the car, the crunch of leaves beneath their feet, the only sound in the suffocating silence. The entrance was barely standing, the door hanging off its hinges, revealing a pitch-black hallway beyond. Emily's hands shook as she gripped her flashlight, stepping inside. The air was thick, stale, the scent of decay and rust lingering in the space. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by the beam of her flashlight as they moved deeper into the building. "This place should have been torn down years ago," Carter murmured, scanning the walls. Emily barely heard him. Her heart was hammering in her chest, her skin prickling with the sensation of being watched. Every step forward felt like stepping further into something she wasn't ready to understand. Then she saw it. A door. Unlike the others, this one was intact. Unmarked. Locked. Emily's breath hitched. "She's in there." Carter examined the lock. "It's reinforced. Someone didn't want anyone getting in or out." Emily's mind raced. There has to be a way. Then a sound. A shuffle. Coming from inside the room. Emily's heart stopped. She pressed her ear against the door, her breath shaky. Then, "Emily?" A voice. Small, faint, but unmistakable. Emily's vision blurred. "Lillian?" A soft gasp from the other side. "Emily, please." Tears burned in her eyes. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm right here." Carter moved quickly, searching for anything that could break the lock. Emily's hands shook as she pressed against the door, desperate to reach her sister. "Hold on," she begged. "We're getting you out." Then, a noise behind them, a slow, deliberate click. Emily turned sharply. Dr. Harrison Clark stood at the end of the hallway, watching them, smiling. "You've come so far," he said, his voice calm. "But you don't understand yet, do you?" Emily's blood turned to ice. "Where is my sister?" Clark tilted his head, amused. "You really think this is about her?" Emily's breath hitched. "What are you talking about?" Clark's smile widened. "Lillian was never the experiment." The world tilted. Emily's knees went weak. "What?" Clark stepped forward, his gaze steady. "It was always you." Emily felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Carter moved in front of her protectively, his entire body tense. "You stay the hell away from her." But Clark wasn't looking at him. He was looking at Emily. "The memories you've been searching for?" he murmured. "They were never yours to remember." Emily's breath shuddered. Her whole life, her entire identity, had been a lie, and she was about to find out why. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps, her fingers gripping the edges of the locked door as if holding onto it would somehow keep her grounded in reality. But the world was shifting beneath her feet, unraveling every truth she had ever known. Clark's words echoed in her skull, each syllable twisting deeper into her mind. "Lillian was never the experiment. It was always you." Her pulse roared in her ears, drowning out everything else. No, that couldn't be right. This was about Lillian. It had always been about Lillian. She had spent the last 3 years chasing her shadow, digging through half-truths, pushing against every locked door until her hands bled. But now, the man who had taken her sister, who had erased her from existence, was standing here, telling her that she had been the one at the center of it all? "You're lying," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dr. Clark tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Am I?" Carter took a step forward, his body a solid barrier between Emily and Clark. "You're done playing games. You're gonna open that door. Now." Clark barely acknowledged him. His cold, assessing gaze remained locked on Emily, as if peeling back the layers of her existence, stripping her down to something raw and unrecognizable. "You want to know the truth?" His voice was calm, almost gentle. "Then open it yourself." Emily's hands trembled as she turned toward the door. Lillian was in there. She had heard her voice, had felt the crack in her soul mend just slightly at the sound of it. She needed to get her out. Carter's grip on his flashlight tightened. "Emily, don't." But she was already moving. Her fingers found the lock, pressing against the cool metal. And then, clicked. Not from the outside, from the inside. Emily barely had time to react before the door swung open, revealing the dimly lit room beyond. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she stepped inside. And there she was, Lillian. Emily's breath caught. She was standing in the middle of the small, windowless room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She was older now, 3 years older than the last time Emily had seen her, but it was her. The same dark hair, the same wide, familiar eyes. But something was wrong. Lillian's expression wasn't one of relief. It wasn't the tearful reunion Emily had dreamed of for so long. Instead, she looked afraid. Not afraid of Clark. Afraid of her. Emily felt her stomach twist into knots. Lillian, her voice cracked. Lillian swallowed hard, taking a hesitant step forward. Emily, don't listen to him. Emily's breath hitched. I came for you, she whispered. I never stopped looking. That's not what he wants you to understand. Lillian cut her off, her voice thick with something Emily couldn't quite name. Carter took a cautious step into the room, his eyes flicking between the two sisters before landing on Clark. Enough. Tell us what the hell is going on. Clark exhaled slowly, as if savoring the moment. You really don't remember? Do you, Emily? Emily clenched her fists. Remember what? Clark's gaze sharpened. Who you really are. The room seemed to shrink around her. The walls pressed in, the air turned thick and suffocating. Emily shook her head, trying to fight the wave of nausea creeping up her throat. You were both here once before? Clark continued, his voice smooth, controlled. But Lillian was never the one they wanted. Emily turned to Lillian, searching for some kind of explanation. But her sister only shook her head frantically, her eyes pleading. Stop, Lillian whispered. Clark ignored her. 3 years ago, we removed something from you, Emily. A memory, a piece of yourself. Emily's stomach twisted. What are you talking about? You were a part of something bigger than you ever realized, Clark said, taking a slow step forward. But we couldn't let you remember. Not until the time was right. Emily felt like she was going to be sick. Her mind was spinning, unraveling, pulling at frayed edges she didn't even know existed. That's not possible, she choked out. But deep inside, something was shifting. A door inside her mind, long locked, was creaking open, and behind it, memories, flashes of something she couldn't fully grasp. A sterile white room, blinding lights, a voice whispering, she can't know. Lillian's hand gripping hers, tight and desperate. Promise. And then nothing. A void. Emily staggered backward, her hands flying to her temples as pain shot through her skull. Emily! Lillian rushed toward her, catching her before she collapsed. What did you do to her? Carter demanded, fury lacing his voice. Clark's expression remained calm. She's remembering. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the images flooding her mind, but they wouldn't stop. And then, a single memory hit her like a freight train. She hadn't been the one looking for Lillian that night. Lillian had been looking for her. Emily's entire body went cold. No, she whispered. No, that's not right. But deep down, she knew. It was right. 3 years ago, it wasn't Lillian who had disappeared. It was Emily. And when she had been brought back, when she had woken up in her own bed, surrounded by people who told her that Lillian was gone, they had erased everything. Emily, please. Lillian's voice shook as she held her sister's face between her hands. You have to fight this. They did something to you. Emily's breath shuddered. Why? She whispered, turning to Clark, her vision blurry with unshed tears. Why would you do this? Clark exhaled, as if she were asking the wrong question. Because you were never supposed to come back. A chilling silence filled the room. Emily's hands trembled. What did you take from me? Clark smiled, but it wasn't comforting. It was knowing. Everything. The ground beneath Emily's feet felt like it was splitting open, threatening to swallow her whole. Her entire life had been rewritten, and now the truth was breaking through. Emily's body felt weightless, like she was floating in the middle of an ocean with no sense of direction, no anchor to hold on to. The walls of the dimly lit room seemed to blur, tilting and shifting as her mind tried to make sense of what Clark had just said. You were never supposed to come back. Her hands trembled as she reached out, gripping the edge of the doorframe for support. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The truth was unraveling too fast, slipping through her fingers like sand, and no matter how hard she tried to grasp it, it just kept falling away. Emily? Lillian's voice was barely a whisper, full of hesitation, full of fear. Emily turned, her vision swimming, her pulse hammering inside her skull. She looked at Lillian, really looked at her, and for the first time, she understood why her sister had been so afraid. She hadn't just been trapped in this facility. She had been waiting for Emily to wake up. Tell me the truth, Emily whispered, her voice hoarse. I need to hear it from you. Lillian hesitated, her fingers twisting together, her gaze darting toward Clark, as if afraid of what he might do if she spoke. Lillian, Emily pleaded, stepping closer. Please. Lillian's lips parted, but no words came out at first. Then, in a voice so soft it barely existed, she whispered, You left first. The words punched through Emily's chest like a blade. She staggered back. No, that's not possible. It is, Clark interjected smoothly, stepping closer. His presence was like a shadow stretching across the room, unshakable, unavoidable. Everything you think you remember about Lillian disappearing is a lie, a carefully placed illusion to keep you from questioning why you were the one who truly vanished. Emily shook her head violently, trying to shake the words away, but they stuck. No, she whispered. I would have known. I would have. They made you forget. Lillian cut her off, her voice stronger now, her fear slowly transforming into something else. Desperation. Emily, don't you understand? They wiped everything. They changed your memories, rewrote them, made you believe that I was the one who disappeared. Emily's stomach twisted painfully. Why? Her voice cracked, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. Why would they do that? Lillian hesitated. Clark didn't. Because you were the experiment, he said simply. Not her. Emily swayed on her feet, her nails digging into her palms. I don't understand. You were part of something much bigger than you ever realized, Clark continued, his voice eerily calm, as if he were explaining a simple fact rather than shattering her entire reality. You and Lillian were born under unique circumstances, identical twins, yet not quite the same. You were different, special. Emily's breathing grew shallow. They wanted to see if a mind could be rewritten, if memories could be reconstructed, if identity itself could be reshaped. Clark took another step forward, his expression unreadable. You were the proof they needed. The room felt like it was spinning. No, Emily whispered. No, I would have known. I would have felt it. Would you? Clark's gaze bore into hers. How much of your childhood do you actually remember, Emily? She opened her mouth to answer, but silence. Cold, suffocating silence. Because she didn't know. The realization hit her like a wrecking ball. She had memories, fragments, scattered moments, but they were foggy, distant, like watching someone else's life through a dirty window. She had always assumed it was just time, just the way memories faded over the years. But now she wasn't so sure. Her chest tightened. What did you do to me? She whispered. Clark's head tilted slightly. We gave you a new story, one that ensured you would never come searching for the truth. Emily's body went cold. You erased me. Not erased, Clark corrected. Rewritten. Emily's entire world crumbled around her. Carter stepped forward, his fists clenched, his patience hanging by a thread. You're telling me you brainwashed a child? You tore her life apart, stole her memories, and expected her to never find out. Clark barely spared him a glance. It was necessary. For what? Carter snapped. To see if it was possible. A sickening silence stretched between them. Emily's hands shook violently. You used me. You used my entire life as an experiment. Clark exhaled, as if bored by the conversation. You were always meant to forget. But then, something changed. Emily's breath hitched. What changed? Clark's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. You started remembering. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't supposed to happen, Clark continued. The process was meant to be permanent. But something inside you resisted, something stronger than we anticipated. And the more you searched for Lillian, the more the truth started to leak through the cracks. Emily's head spun. And now, Clark murmured, you remember enough to destroy everything. A beat of silence. Then, Lillian grabbed her wrist. We have to go, she whispered urgently. Now. But Emily was frozen. Carter wasn't. He lunged for Clark, grabbing him by the collar. You don't get to walk away from this. Clark didn't flinch. He simply smiled. Do you really think you can stop what's already been set in motion? Carter's grip tightened, his rage barely contained. Where are the rest of the records? Clark's expression didn't change. You're asking the wrong questions. Tell me where they are. But Clark just shook his head. You're wasting time. His gaze flickered toward Emily. She's still slipping. The memories will keep coming now. And soon enough, she'll realize that what we erased wasn't just the past. Emily's chest constricted painfully. What does that mean? She demanded. Clark smiled. It means you're not done remembering yet. Then, a loud crash, the sound of footsteps rushing toward them. Carter barely had time to react before the door behind them burst open, and men in dark clothing flooded the room. Move! Carter grabbed Emily's arm, shoving her toward the exit. Lillian clung to her wrist, pulling her forward. Emily's pulse roared as they ran, the facility walls blurring past them, Clark's voice echoing in her mind. You were never supposed to come back. The pieces were falling into place, and soon she would remember everything. Emily ran. The pounding of her heart matched the rhythm of her footsteps as she tore down the darkened hallway. Lillian's hand clutched in hers. Carter was right behind them, his breathing ragged but steady as they navigated the endless maze of the abandoned facility. The sound of boots thudding against the concrete floor echoed behind them. Chasing, hunting. The men in black clothing were gaining on them. This way, Carter shouted, yanking open a rusted door and shoving them inside. The room was dark, damp, the scent of decay thick in the air. Emily barely had time to register where they were before Carter slammed the door shut and jammed an old metal rod against the handle. That won't hold them for long, Lillian whispered, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Emily's mind was a storm. The memories Clark had awakened swirling in fragmented, half-formed pieces. Nothing felt real. Everything she thought she had known, her childhood, her identity, her very existence, had been manipulated, rewritten. And now, standing in the middle of a forgotten room, surrounded by ghosts of a past she couldn't fully remember, she felt like she was slipping. Emily, Lillian's voice pulled her back. We have to keep moving. Emily met her sister's gaze. The girl she had spent years searching for. The girl she had believed was lost. But now she knew the truth. Lillian had never been the one who was lost. It had always been her. Where does that door lead? Carter asked, pointing to another rusted doorway at the back of the room. Lillian hesitated. I don't know. I've never been this far. Emily frowned. Then where were you? This whole time? Where did they keep you? Lillian swallowed, shifting uncomfortably. I don't remember everything. She stopped, shaking her head. They did something to me too. Emily's stomach twisted. Before she could say anything else, the door behind them rattled violently. They're coming, Carter muttered, pushing them toward the other exit. Emily grabbed the handle and pulled. The door groaned but gave way, revealing a narrow, winding staircase leading downward. The air was colder here, thick with moisture, the scent of earth and stone clinging to the walls. A basement, Carter whispered. Lillian hesitated. I think it's more than that. Emily's pulse quickened. Come on. They descended carefully, each step creaking beneath their weight. The deeper they went, the more suffocating the air became, the darkness pressing against them like a living thing. Emily kept one hand against the damp wall, her fingers trailing over jagged bricks. Then, at the bottom of the stairs, the hallway opened up into a vast underground chamber. Emily's breath caught. The space was lined with rows of metal gurneys, each one covered in dust-covered white sheets. The walls were adorned with old, yellowed documents, medical records pinned haphazardly to corkboards. Broken equipment lay scattered across the floor, their wires coiled like dead snakes. And in the center of the room, a massive filing cabinet. Carter exhaled sharply. "This is it." Emily rushed forward, her hands shaking as she pulled open the top drawer. Files. Stacks upon stacks of files. She flipped through them, her eyes scanning names, dates, medical terms she didn't understand. "This facility wasn't just a hospital," Carter murmured, flipping through another set of documents. "It was a testing ground." Emily's throat tightened. Testing for what? Memory reconstruction, identity suppression, psychological conditioning. Lillian whispered, her voice hollow. Emily's hands froze over a file. Her own name was written on the tab. She swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she pulled it out. The papers inside were brittle, the ink smudged, but the words jumped out at her like ghosts from the past. Subject 02, Emily Thompson. Experiment status, successful. Procedure, memory partition completed. Result, identity shift achieved. Emily's breath shuddered. "They rewired me," she whispered. Carter's expression darkened. "They didn't just erase memories. They changed who you were." Emily's grip on the file tightened, her nails digging into the paper. "Then who was I before?" Silence. "Then..." Lillian reached forward, her hands shaking, and pulled out another file. Subject 01, Lillian Thompson. Experiment status, failed. Procedure, memory partition attempted. Result, incomplete suppression. Emily's vision blurred as she stared at the paper. "They tried to do it to you too," she whispered, looking at Lillian. Her sister nodded slowly. "But it didn't work. That's why they kept me here. That's why they couldn't let me go." Emily's chest ached. "And me?" Lillian hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edges of the document. "You were their success." The world tilted. Emily shook her head. "No, that's not. You don't remember because they made you forget, Emily," Lillian said desperately. "They took everything. They changed you." Emily's breath came in shallow gasps. Then, from behind them, "You were never supposed to find this." Clark's voice sent ice down her spine. Emily spun around, her heart hammering. Clark stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his presence suffocating. "You don't get to take this away from me again," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. Clark tilted his head slightly, as if considering her. "You still don't understand, do you?" Emily clenched her fists. "Then make me understand." Clark exhaled, taking a slow step forward. "You weren't just a subject, Emily. You were the proof they needed. That identity could be rewritten, that a person could be turned into someone else entirely. They created you, piece by piece, memory by memory." The Emily standing here right now, his lips curled. "She's a construct." Emily's knees went weak. Carter moved between them. "We're done listening to you." Clark smiled. "Are you?" Then suddenly, the room trembled. A loud, metallic groan echoed through the basement as dust rained from the ceiling. Emily's stomach lurched. "They're collapsing the building," Lillian gasped. Clark didn't move. "You don't get to leave, Emily. You never did." Emily locked eyes with him. Then she grabbed Lillian's hand. "Run." Carter was already pulling at a side door, shoving it open as the walls groaned under the weight of destruction. They sprinted through the darkened hallway, the sound of falling debris roaring behind them. Emily's lungs burned, her legs screaming in protest, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Then light, the exit. They burst through it just as the facility crumbled behind them, dust and rubble crashing to the ground in a deafening roar. Emily collapsed onto the grass, gasping for air. Lillian was beside her, shaking, her fingers digging into the dirt as if grounding herself to reality. Carter stood, panting, his eyes scanning the destruction. Is he? Emily couldn't finish the question. Carter didn't answer. Silence stretched between them. Then Lillian turned to Emily, tears brimming in her eyes. "We're free," she whispered. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. But were they? Or had the real battle only just begun?